Linear perspective, an event in art. So in the interests of getting as many different subjects as we possibly can into this module, we're going to talk about art, visual art, as well as the dramatic arts, which we've been studying until now. And it's not that I'm an expert in art. I just think that the development of perspective in art in the 13 and 1400s is an event which we can use as an example of Badiou's event theory. So you have to have watched the video about event first, and now we're going to apply it to something that happened in history. So let's get going. And since we've only just had the festival of the Annunciation on the 25th of March, I thought we could look at Fra Angelico's The Annunciation painting from 1445, which is his most reproduced work. The Annunciation is when the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she's pregnant with Jesus, and the festival is 9 months before Christmas, of course, because that's how long it takes to be pregnant. Fra Angelico lived in Florence and was quite an influential painter. We can see already now that there is a 3D feel to this painting, and if we compare it with this miniature from Germany around the same from the 13th century, you can see what the difference is. There is no perspective in this. There are just lines on lines. It's not intended to be to introduce perspective, and although there were some small intentions, some people believe in perspective in art before this time. Really, we need to realize how massive this development must have felt for the people in the 13 and the 1400s. Suddenly they see what is behind, that the world looks like, the painting looks like the world. That one thing is behind the other, and that can be portrayed in art in a way that it hadn't been portrayed in these slightly more surface effects, which were traditional in the Middle Ages, and that's what we see in the rest of the Middle Ages. So this was quite a big development. By 1445, it is possible to get some technical accuracy. You can see that Fra Angelico has actually drawn some lines in the painting himself, but this is technically correct linear perspective. And the reason we call it linear perspective is that all the lines in this painting are meant to go to the vanishing point. If I can be as barbaric enough as to destroy this painting with drawing some lines into it, you can see I've connected the parallel pillars up with this, and the edge of the carpet and the edge of the platform, and even Fra Angelico clearly loved this technique so much that he's even had the chair that Mary is sitting on completely regular in a square on to the lines of perspective. So everything goes towards a vanishing point, and it's a technical skill, but the effects are that you see as something 3D. And like I say, it would have been extremely shocking to the people that, of the time to see this effect. That suddenly must have felt as if there was a thick theatre that they were looking at rather than a 2D surface or canvas. There are other things that happened in the Middle Ages and that ended up in the Renaissance, like shadow effects that we see a little bit in the roof here, and different materials. I just thought we should look at this as one event. So we can say that the arrival of perspective in fine art is the event that we're looking at. Now, let's look at the background for this event. What was visible in Florence in 1445? Well, first of all, there were already, like I say, Fra Angelico was not the first one. He wasn't even the first one to apply perspective to this particular theme. In fact, if he'd travelled to Dijon, then he would have been able to see this painting by Van Eyck, which in many ways takes further, takes a lot of different steps. You can see this, the faces in this, for example, don't really resemble the Byzantine predecessors, whereas they do in Fra Angelico's. I doubt I doubt he would have seen this, but the point is that this was happening. It was in the air, if you like, that the idea of applying perspective to the portrayal of the Annunciation was a natural thing to do. But let's see what happened actually in Florence. Now, in 1435, again, immediately before Fra Angelico completed this, they had Italian artists had even conceptualized and theorized the perspective idea, and this is you can see these arrows here, or these lines, portray what I did to the painting before, and this is actually a picture taken from the book De Pictura from 1435. So that Fra Angelico had access to this. This is written by a friend of his, and he had access to this knowledge, and he could apply it. And like I say, he loved to apply it. Also, if he'd gone to Santa Croce, the church in one of the churches in Florence, he would have been able to see Donatello's portrayal of the Annunciation. Also, and you can see how there are echoes of this sculpture in Fra Angelico's, the posture of the angel Gabriel, and the scene in general. There isn't obviously a great deal of perspective in this because sculpture is 3D by its nature, but you can see at least there are two levels to this sculpture. There is both a background and a foreground, which must have set him thinking. Also, at this time, his friend Brunelleschi, or at least his artistic contemporary in Florence, was working on Florence Cathedral. Now, cathedrals take more than a couple of years to produce, so the cathedral had been in the works since the mid 1300s for a very long time at this point. But Brunelleschi was also thinking through and practicing how we can portray perspective, and was working on the dome of the cathedral at this time. And we can see how just the practice of going past a series of pillars like this, or standing in a cathedral, a Gothic cathedral like this, will set your mind thinking about how you would portray this in reality. And this Florence cathedral has its own little vanishing point in place, so that you can this picture wasn't done in this way, but you can see how you would portray Florence Cathedral in a way that lends itself to it. Seems obvious that you need to use these vanishing points because of the parallel lines of the pillars. So everything was contributing towards Fra Angelico producing this piece of writing, both his contemporaries, the thought, the thinking, and the places in which he was living, and other parallel developments and other forms of art. So what happened after Fra Angelico's? What happened after the event of the arrival of linear perspective in painting? Famously, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, later on in the Renaissance, paints his own version of the Annunciation, and takes it on in ways that add everything that Leonardo da Vinci, of course, brought to the to art, the mystic background, the developed background. He's not just interested in the foreground; he's also interested in realism in the background. His own facial expressions, but also a fidelity to Fra Angelico's idea of, or at least the medieval, the early Renaissance idea of perspective. You can see his we've got perspective in the floor, in the multi layers between the background and the foreground, and the square buildings. Although Fra Angelico will actually put this very strongly in focus. You can't ignore the idea of perspective in Fra Angelico. Leonardo da Vinci just has one of the many strings to his bow. So Leonardo da Vinci doesn't look like Fra Angelico, but he's definitely keeping that as one of the aspects to his paintings. And here we've also got the got to write and keep it up, Maestro di Campi in 1550, so about 100 years after Fra Angelico. A tiny weeny bit of perspective here you can see in the roof and the walls, but in many ways De Campi is reverting to the Byzantine style. We've got much less perspective involved, and the facial expressions are more in keeping with the pre-Renaissance style. So we can say that although this takes place after Fra Angelico, it is not especially faithful to Fra Angelico's development. Whereas El Greco, who does his own thing and completely transforms the tradition, portrays his version of the Annunciation while still keeping to the aspect of perspective. It's like you can't do Annunciation pictures without actually introducing your own versions of perspective. As you can see down here at the floor, it's a really rigid version of a square tile perspective. He's actually completely keeping to the tradition. So these are three things that came afterwards. Interestingly, the one that those who are most in keeping with the event of perspective are not necessarily the ones that are longest from the perspective in time. So the 1550 version, which I thought would revert to the old to the pre-perspective painting tradition, is actually 100 years after Fra Angelico. De Campi had plenty of time to reflect over and to refine his techniques, and perspective just didn't seem to use it, and certainly wasn't drinking of the well that Leonardo da Vinci was drinking of in trying to attain realism, both in the facial expression and in the perspective and the backgrounds. So the point is that we've got this event that has happened. It's got a background context, and then afterwards we have a painting tradition that can either keep close to that event, or develop on that and build on that event, or revert to what was happening before that event. And these are all elements of event-like applications that you can make to your cultural analysis. There are an event, it has multivalent transformations. It changes how we see the world, but also changes what we do, how we understand things, and how we move from space to space. It doesn't come from nowhere, but it also develops into something. And this idea that it doesn't come from nowhere is actually a criticism of Badiou. One of the criticisms of Badiou is that his events seem to come from nowhere, whereas a lot of the most important events in history seem to have had a very important structure and relation to their past. But after the event, you can be faithful to it and you can continue it, or you can just revert. So there is a choice. It gives you a choice. And these are the elements that I want to see if you are using the concept of event to interpret your rituals or forms of life or transformations or alternative understandings of ways of life when you are writing.